The air in the narrow, temperature-controlled archive room tasted of ozone and decaying paper. Dust motes, illuminated by the single hanging bulb, danced in a perpetual, slow-motion blizzard. Elias Thorne, or the man known as Elias Thorne for the last 28 years of his life in the sprawling anonymity of Chicago, held his breath, his knuckles white against the edge of the steel shelving unit. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in the sub-basement of the County Records Annex, a place rumored to house the legally dead files, the sealed, the discredited, the intentionally forgotten. He was a mid-level accountant, meticulous, predictable, a man whose existence was defined by spreadsheets and the quiet hum of a rented apartment. Yet, here he was, illuminated by the harsh yellow light, a heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird demanding release. It wasn't the fear of trespassing that choked him. It was the contents of the small, brittle cardboard box resting on the rolling cart beside him. The box had arrived 3 weeks ago, anonymous, postmarked from a defunct P.O. box in rural Ohio, containing nothing but a layer of desiccated lavender and a stack of letters tied with sun-faded crimson string. He had opened the first letter at home, under the sterile glare of his kitchen light. It was dated 1997. The handwriting was elegant, looping, distinctly feminine, addressing someone named Mikhail. My dearest Misha, the crossing is perilous, but your courage shines brighter than any beacon. Hold fast to the name we agreed upon. Remember the song of the pines. When you arrive, seek the address I left with Mr. Petrov. You are no longer the boy who left Odessa. You are Julian Vance now. Be Julian Vance. For both our sakes. Mikhail. Julian Vance. Elias Thorne. The names felt like layers of ill-fitting skin. He traced the edges of the third letter, the one that had driven him to this clandestine excursion. It contained a crudely drawn map, pointing vaguely towards this very building, with a single, damning annotation scrawled in the margin. The original birth certificate copy remains in File B 44/Annex Sub. Elias, no Julian, reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the heavy, dust-coated manila folder marked B44. The archive supervisor, a taciturn man named Mr. Henderson whose primary occupation seemed to be ignoring the existence of the public, had signed off on Elias's research request with unnerving ease, perhaps thinking the requested files were merely obscure property deeds. He pulled the folder free. It weighed almost nothing. The latch clicked open with the sound of a gunshot in the silence. Inside, beneath layers of municipal paperwork concerning defunct sewer lines, was a slim envelope sealed with thick, yellowed wax, bearing the faded crest of a long-defunct Polish consulate. Elias stared at the seal, the intricate design of a rearing griffin. He had never been to Poland. He had always believed he was born in a small village in Ukraine, brought to the U.S. by his loving, and now deceased, adoptive parents at the age of 5, clutching a faded photograph and a story of tragic orphaned resilience. He tore the envelope open. The documents inside were stiff, official, smelling faintly of iodine. The top document was a birth certificate. Name Julian Vasilyevich Volkov. Date of birth, May 12, 1989. Place of birth, Lviv, Ukrainian SSR. But beneath the Cyrillic script, stamped across the bottom in faded blue ink, was an American State Department endorsement. And the photograph, a small black and white image of a serious, dark-haired boy with eyes too old for his 7 years, was undeniably him. Elias Thorne, the accountant, ceased to exist in that sterile room. A visceral, terrifying wave of dislocation hit him. He wasn't Elias Thorne. He wasn't even Julian Vance. He was Julian Volkov, or perhaps a shadow created by one. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the metal stairs creaked open. A sliver of hallway light cut through the gloom. Mr. Thorne? Everything all right down there? I thought I heard a noise. Henderson's voice was gravelly, laced with suspicion. Elias's survival instinct, honed by years of unconsciously maintaining a facade, snapped into place. He slammed the folder shut, shoved the documents deep into the inner pocket of his coat, and snatched the small box of letters. He knew he couldn't explain this. Not now. "Fine, Mr. Henderson," Elias called out, his voice shockingly steady despite the internal earthquake. "Just a shelf shifting. I think I have everything I need." He walked towards the stairs, his steps measured, but inside, the map to his true life, and the unknown catastrophe that necessitated its concealment, was burning against his skin. He had found the first piece of the puzzle, but the picture it revealed was a terrifying void where his entire past should have been. He had to get out, disappear into the city noise, and understand who had stolen his name, and why they had waited 2 decades to send the clues. Back in the deceptive safety of his cramped apartment, Elias spent the next week in a fugue state, the city outside roaring in cheerful ignorance of his silent crisis. He called in sick to work, claiming a severe flu. He lived on black coffee and the contents of the old letters. The letters painted a portrait of a fractured family and a desperate escape. The author, Liana, was his mother. She wrote with an urgency that transcended the years, detailing clandestine meetings, forged papers, and the agonizing decision to send her young son away to the West. The key names that repeated were Mikhail, the name he was supposed to use initially, and the exchange. The 4th letter was the most detailed, dated shortly after his supposed arrival in the U.S. in 1995. "Misha, my brave boy, the situation is worse than we feared. The contact in Warsaw failed. They took the wrong child. They took you, my light, and left the other one, the replacement, to go through. We tried to stop the transfer, but the corruption went too high. You are safe, but you are not you. The Vance family is protecting you, keeping you hidden under their name until we can fix this. Do not trust anyone who asks about the sea. Remember only the Pines. They will send you proof eventually. Find the registry. Find the ledger. You must reclaim your name, Julian Volkov. They replaced you with someone else's ghost." Replaced. The word echoed in the quiet apartment. He wasn't just given a false identity. Someone else had been sent in his stead. He wasn't the orphan who narrowly escaped Eastern Europe. He was the child stolen from that escape route. Elias looked at his reflection. The mild brown eyes, the unremarkable brown hair, the precise features that had never once felt like his own. Who was the boy who looked exactly like him, now living his life in some other city, perhaps even in his own skin? Driven by a cold, methodical panic, Elias shifted his focus from emotion to action. He needed context for the names. He returned to the birth certificate, Julian Vasilyevich Volkov, born Lviv, 1989. He cross-referenced the date and place with online archives, anything he could access without triggering alarms. The political climate of Lviv in the late 80s and early 90s was chaotic, a nexus of emerging black market operations and post-Soviet instability. He found digitized news clippings mentioning a minor diplomatic scandal involving the movement of certain high-value minors during a chaotic relocation program intended for defectors and their children. The scandal had been quickly buried. He focused on the note about the Vance family protecting him. Elias Thorne had no known living relatives. His adoptive parents, the Thornes, had died in a hiking accident a decade prior, leaving him completely untethered. He pulled out the last, most significant piece of evidence. A single, yellowed business card found tucked inside the final letter. Dr. Silas Vance, Ph.D., Ethnobotanical Research and Rare Species Preservation. Address, 412 Willow Creek Lane, Havenwood, Maine. Havenwood, a small town in Maine, far from the concrete canyons of Chicago. And Silas Vance, a name linked to his assumed identity, Julian Vance. Elias booked the next available train ticket. He needed to see this Silas Vance. The name felt like a key turning in a rusted lock, promising either freedom or a final, fatal confrontation. He packed only essentials, stuffing the box of letters into a worn canvas satchel, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of being an imposter settle over him once more. The journey was agonizingly slow. As the landscape changed from flat Midwest plains to the rugged, pine-scented hills of New England, Elias felt the psychological pressure mount. Every polite interaction with a fellow passenger was a performance. He was Elias Thorne, a quiet accountant, Yet every fiber of his being knew he was navigating toward the truth of Julian Volkov, a child who had vanished before his story even began. When the train finally pulled into the tiny station in Havenwood, the air was sharp with the smell of salt and pine needles. Havenwood was aggressively quaint, a town that seemed perpetually dusted with autumn leaves, existing outside the rush of the modern world. Dr. Silas Vance's property was secluded, set back from the main road by a long, winding driveway bordered by towering, ancient white pines, the very trees his mother had mentioned in her cryptic letter. Elias walked the last half-mile, the satchel heavy against his side. He found the house, a sprawling, somewhat dilapidated Victorian manor, charmingly overgrown with ivy. A single light burned in an upstairs window. He approached the massive oak front door, rehearsing the words he would use. He wouldn't mention the letters. He would simply ask about Julian Vance. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could connect, the door swung inward. Standing there was an elderly man, thin and stooped, with eyes that seemed both infinitely weary and incredibly sharp. He wore a tweed jacket several sizes too large and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dried herbs. "You're late," Dr. Vance said, his voice thin but firm. He didn't ask who Elias was. He just looked at him with an unnerving recognition. "Come in, Mr. Thorne. Or should I say Julian?" Silas Vance ushered Elias into a library that was less a room and more a shrine to forgotten knowledge. Books lined every wall, ceiling to floor, interspersed with dried botanical specimens mounted under glass domes. "I've been expecting you, though perhaps not so directly," Silas said, closing the heavy door with a muffled thud that sealed them into their shared secret. He gestured toward a leather armchair. "Coffee? I have an excellent Colombian blend, though I suspect the man who drinks only instant might be cautious." Elias sat down, the shock of being instantly recognized overriding his caution. How did you know my name was Julian?" Silas sighed, moving to a mahogany desk cluttered with maps and microscopes. "Because I knew the boy who should have been Julian Vance. And I knew the boy who was Julian Vance. You are the anomaly, the switch." Silas settled opposite him, his gaze unwavering. "My involvement was unintentional, born of desperation and profound stupidity 25 years ago. I was the one who arranged the adoption papers for the Vance family, attempting to secure passage for my relative out of the collapsing political climate in Lviv. The papers were clean, the connections deep, but the system, Elias or Julian, is more brutal and far more complex than hopeful idealists believe." Silas reached for a heavy, leather-bound book resting on the corner of his desk. Its spine cracked. It was a ledger. "This is the original exchange ledger," Silas admitted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The one that proves the switch. It documents the transfer of two boys, identical in age, near identical in appearance, both being funneled through a chaotic network of international adoption intermediaries." He opened the book to a heavily annotated page. Two photographs were pasted side by side, both taken perhaps a year before the transfer. The boy on the left was Elias, the boy who grew up as Elias Thorne, the one sitting across from Silas now. He looked fragile, earnest. The boy on the right was someone else. Sharper features, a faint, challenging scar above his left eyebrow. "The boy on the right," Silas explained, tapping the image, "is the true Julian Vance. He was supposed to be adopted by the Vances here in Maine, a safe, quiet upbringing. The boy on the left, your true self, Julian Volkov, was meant to be reunited with his mother's contact in Warsaw." Elias stared at the face that was not his own, the face of the Julian Vance he was meant to be. A lifetime of memories. Chicago winters, the office politics, the cautious, unremarkable life, suddenly felt like cheap wallpaper pasted over a gaping hole. "What happened to the real Julian Vance?" Elias asked, his voice tight. "And who am I?" "You are Julian Volkov," Silas confirmed grimly. "But the exchange went wrong in the Warsaw transit point. The agents, corrupt, operating for profit, not politics, shipped the wrong child onward. They sent you, Julian Volkov, the son of the dissident Liana, to the Thornes in Chicago, using a pre-prepared identity to cover the tracks of the true Julian Vance, who they sold elsewhere. They substituted you for the real Vance heir to cover their tracks in a political extraction that went sideways. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Sold? Where? That, Silas said, closing the ledger with a decisive snap, is the part one couldn't uncover until recently. The Vances who were supposed to adopt the real Julian Vance, my estranged cousins, were furious. They assumed their adoption was compromised. They used their considerable influence to have the trail disappear entirely, erasing the other boys' existence from their records, fearing scandal or exposure. They adopted a different child shortly after, under a different pretense, and vanished from public life. And the letters? Elias pressed. Why now? Liana, your mother, was relentless. She never stopped fighting. She spent decades tracing the corruption. She died last month, Elias, but not before she managed to force the truth out of a dying accomplice. The accomplice revealed the ledger's location and the initial switch point. She mailed you the key to unlock the file here, hoping you'd have the stability to confront this. Elias looked down at his hands, the hands of an accountant. He wasn't strong enough for this confrontation. He felt brittle, a collection of borrowed routines. So, if I am Julian Volkov? Elias began, the unfamiliar name tasting strange on his tongue. And the boy who looks like me is Julian Vance. Where is that Julian Vance now? Silas leaned forward, his eyes suddenly blazing with an intensity that belied his age. He is living your life, Elias. Or rather, the life that was intended for you under the Vance name. He was placed with the Thornes but under the Vance identity. He became Elias Thorne. The realization hit Elias like physical blow. The stability, the predictability of his life as Elias Thorne. It had been a carefully constructed cage built by people trying to hide the real switch. The Thornes hadn't adopted him. They had unknowingly taken in the stolen child who should have been Julian Vance. And the man who existed now as Elias Thorne was the one who had been placed into that life. The boy who is Elias Thorne now, Silas clarified, reading the horror on his face, is Julian Vance. He has inherited the identity you are currently occupying, the identity I helped create in the first place. The Vances influence erased the Volkov paperwork and cemented the Thorne identity for him. Elias stood up, pacing the small space between the desk and the armchair. The psychological vertigo was immense. He wasn't just reclaiming his past. He was erasing someone else's present. I need to see this ledger, Elias insisted, pointing to the heavy book. I need the proof that ties me to Liana, and the proof that identifies the real Julian Vance. Silas hesitated, fiddling with a dried flower stem. It's dangerous, Elias. If the people who orchestrated this decades ago thought the Volkov boy was successfully absorbed into the Thornes' quiet life, they might have forgotten about him. Bringing this ledger into the light resurrects the entire plot. It exposes both of you. I can't live as a ghost anymore, Elias said, the words driven by a desperation that finally broke through his accountant's reserve. I need to know who I am, and I need to find out what happened to the boy who was forced to become me. Silas nodded slowly, defeat mixing with a flicker of pride. Very well. The ledger details the entire transaction, including the brokers and the final destinations. But the key is the Vance family. They covered their tracks by moving to anonymity after the adoption scandal. If we can trace them, we find the other Julian. He opened the ledger again, his aged finger tracing entries written in fading ink. The true Julian Vance was placed with a family who specialized in antiquarian books and rare manuscript restoration. They moved out of Maine immediately following the adoption failure. I only have a faint lead, a forwarding address sent to a shell corporation in Delaware, dated 1998. Silas scribbled the name of the corporation and the state onto a slip of paper. Go to Delaware, Elias. Find the paper trail for this corporation. If the real Julian Vance is living the life of Elias Thorne, we must find him before the people who arranged the switch realize that the loose thread, the letters, have finally been pulled. The tension in the room was thick, woven from decades of deception. Elias left Havenwood before dawn, clutching the slip of paper, now feeling a desperate urgency to collide with the mirror image of his stolen life. Delaware offered no quiet retreat. It was all sharp edges, corporate towers, and anonymity bought with money. Elias rented a cheap motel room near the industrial park where the Shell Corporation, Ethelred Holdings, was supposedly registered. For 3 days, he immersed himself in the labyrinthine world of corporate filings. A world he, the accountant, should have been comfortable in, yet now found terrifyingly foreign. He was navigating the infrastructure of lies that had been built around him. He finally found a nexus point. Ethelred Holdings had recently liquidated its assets, but the final major transaction pointed to the purchase of a substantial property in Astoria, Queens, New York, in 2003, the year Elias Thorne would have been 14. Astoria, a vibrant, sprawling neighborhood, and the target, the man who was living as Elias Thorne, was apparently operating under the same assumed identity for nearly 2 decades. He drove to New York, the tension tightening with every mile. The confrontation he dreaded was inevitable. He had to meet the man who possessed his ghost. Astoria was loud, crowded, and vibrant. He found the address on the property deed. A handsome brownstone converted into luxury condos. The name listed on the management ledger for Unit 3B was Elias Thorne. Elias Thorne was an architect. He checked the portfolio online. The work was clean, modern, structurally ambitious, a stark contrast to the safe, predictable life Elias had led as an accountant. The man who was Julian Vance had, it seemed, embraced the potential inherent in the Elias Thorne identity, turning it into something successful and visible. He staked out the building for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, he saw him. He was leaving the building promptly at 8:15 a.m., impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He was taller than Elias remembered seeing in old high school photos, fitter, radiating an air of quiet confidence that Elias had always desperately tried to emulate in his own small ways. But the face. It was his face. Identical bone structure, the same shade of brown hair, though styled with more care, more deliberate artistry. Yet, when the architect paused to adjust his cufflink, Elias saw the subtle difference Liana's letter had described. The real Julian Vance possessed a tiny, faded scar just above his left eyebrow, almost obscured by meticulous grooming, but undeniably there. Elias felt a profound, nauseating sense of dissociation. He was looking at himself, yet utterly alien. He waited until the architect, Julian Vance, living as Elias Thorne, had walked 3 blocks toward the subway entrance. Then Elias followed, a shadow fueled by 2 decades of misplaced identity. He trailed him through the morning rush, the architect moving with the easy grace of someone who belonged entirely in his environment. Elias felt like a clumsy intruder. Finally, Julian Vance stopped outside a large, modern architectural firm, Vance and Associates. He paused, checking his watch before entering. This was the moment. Elias approached, his throat dry. He bypassed the revolving door and caught Julian just as he reached for the brass handle. "Elias Thorne?" Elias asked, his voice rough. Julian Vance turned. His expression shifted instantly from professional focus to confusion, then, startlingly, to cold, calculating recognition. The architect's practiced facade cracked just enough for Elias to see the flicker of panic beneath. "Can I help you?" Julian asked, his voice smooth, resonant. The voice Elias had always wished he had. "We need to talk," Elias said, stepping closer, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. He lowered his voice. "Liana sent me the letters. The ledger is in Maine. We need to discuss the switch, Julian." The name hit Julian Vance like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving the faint scar standing out starkly. He gripped the door handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You're insane," Julian hissed, trying to maintain composure. "I don't know who you are." "Security." "Don't," Elias warned, his accountant precision sharpening into something more primal. "Don't call security. The file they gave me in Chicago, the one that made me Elias Thorne, it's a fraud. The Thornes adopted you. I am Julian Volkov." Julian Vance looked around frantically. He stepped back, pulling Elias into the alcove beside the entrance, away from the street. Volkov, Julian whispered, the sound laced with genuine fear. That's impossible. The Vances told me. They said the transfer went wrong, that my parents died, that the Thornes saved me, gave me the new papers, that you were the one who died in the exchange. They lied, Elias stated flatly. Liana survived long enough to send me the proof. The real Julian Vance was supposed to be here in this life. I am the one who was misplaced. The architect stared, processing the shattering implications. Two identical men standing on the street corner of Manhattan, their entire existence built on a single, terrible bureaucratic error decades ago. Who are Liana and Silas Vance? Julian demanded, his architect's control battling the rising tide of existential dread. My mother and the man who helped engineer the initial botched escape, Elias explained. They connected the dots. The system that placed me as Elias Thorne was a cover-up, ensuring the real Vance heir was secure, while burying the Volkov child somewhere safe until the scandal cooled. Julian leaned against the cold stone of the building, suddenly looking very young and very lost, the tailored suit offering no armor against the collapse of his reality. If you are Volkov, Julian said slowly, his eyes boring into Elias, then who is my mother? Who are the people who raised me? The Thornes, Elias supplied. Kind people. They thought they were adopting a refugee boy named Elias Thorne. They never knew they were raising the true Julian Vance. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of two parallel lives colliding. Julian Vance, the successful architect, was now facing the fact that his entire memory of grief, adoption, and belonging was based on a substitution. I need proof, Julian finally stated, recovering his architectural precision. If you have the ledger, you have the key. Meet me tonight. Not here. Somewhere private. I need to see what Liana sent you, Volkov. Elias nodded. He had found his quarry. The final confrontation would not be a battle of strength, but a reckoning of paperwork and buried truth. Meet me at the old storage unit Silas Vance directed me to in Chicago, Elias proposed, naming the location where he'd first found the box. Tomorrow night, we compare notes. We find out who benefits from keeping us both silent. Julian Vance, the man who had been Elias Thorne, looked older, the confidence momentarily stripped away. Tomorrow night. Don't be late. I have spent 28 years being meticulous. I won't let a ghost disrupt my life now. The return journey to Chicago was spent in a state of feverish anticipation. Elias had secured access to the dusty storage unit in the dilapidated warehouse district, Unit 714, the place Liana had used as a temporary drop point before mailing the letters. He arrived first, unlocking the unit with the key Silas had mailed him. Inside, the unit was sparsely furnished. A single folding chair, a bare overhead bulb, and one small metal filing cabinet, untouched for years. This was where Liana had kept the evidence of the cover-up of the switch, distinct from the ledger Silas possessed. Elias opened the cabinet. Inside, he found a stack of carefully preserved documents related to the Thorne family, the falsified background checks used to vet them as suitable adoptive parents for Elias Thorne in the mid-90s. There were letters from a paralegal agency in Boston, referencing an urgent request to create a clean identity for a child entering their care, emphasizing the need for total anonymity regarding the source. When Julian Vance, still calling himself Elias Thorne, arrived precisely at the designated time, he looked haggard. He wore a dark, unbranded jacket over his architect suit, looking more like a spy than a successful businessman. This place smells like failure, Julian remarked, surveying the dusty unit, but his eyes immediately darted to the open cabinet. This is where they built the lie that became my life, Elias countered, gesturing toward the cabinet. The Thornes were vetted to accept a specific narrative. They were good people, but they were used as a shield. Julian pulled out the ledger Silas had given Elias, the original exchange record, and laid it next to the background files. The two sets of documents, when placed side by side, formed a chillingly complete timeline of the fraud. My adoptive parents, Julian began, his voice tight with controlled emotion. They always spoke of the tragedy, the war zone, the necessity of giving the refugee boy a stable future. They believed they were saving Elias Thorne. And they were, Elias pointed out. They saved you, Julian. They gave you the foundation to become this successful man. Julian looked at the photograph of the two boys in the ledger, the identical faces separated by ink and fate. But what about your life, Volkov? The Thornes didn't know about you. You were placed with a different set of handlers, someone who maintained the facade of Elias Thorne until you were old enough to blend seamlessly into an accounting career. A career that would keep you unnoticed, out of the public eye. The network that took me was designed for deep concealment, Elias confirmed, recalling the sparse details his adoptive parents had provided about their own, vague connections. They made sure I became Elias Thorne the accountant. Safe, boring, uninteresting enough to avoid scrutiny. They spent the next hour tracing the names listed in the ledger, the middlemen, the corrupt consular officials, the shadow adoption brokers. They found a pattern. All major figures connected to the exchange were either deceased or had vanished entirely by the early 2000s. The trail of the primary conspirators was cold. But one name, listed as the final overseer of the Vance family adoption, remained active: Marcus Albright. Albright, Julian breathed, recognizing the name from his own background checks. A former family lawyer who handled all their asset transfers in the 90s. He managed the transfer of the Vance estate into the trust that funded my entire education. He also managed the background checks for the Thornes, Elias added, pointing to a signature on the Boston document. He was the linchpin. He controlled both identities, ensuring the right boy ended up in the right fabricated life, and that the real Julian Vance was erased from the public record, becoming Elias Thorne. Why? Julian asked, slamming his fist lightly on the metal filing cabinet. Why risk so much to switch two children, unless one of them wasn't just a child? Unless one of us was more valuable? They searched the deeper files Elias had secured. Tucked beneath a thick tax document, Elias found a single, heavily coded letter addressed to Albright, dated 1995, referencing the asset. Julian took the letter and, using his architect's eye for pattern recognition, quickly deciphered the rudimentary substitution cipher Liana had warned about. The decoded text was chilling. The Volkov child is essential cargo. Secure the Vance replacement in a known, stable environment. The asset must remain untainted by his true lineage until the transfer window closes. The true Vance heir is expendable collateral, easily absorbed by the suburban mechanism. Containment must be absolute. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. The asset. It means, Julian whispered, his voice devoid of its former confidence, that the Volkov boy, you were the target. You were the one they needed to keep hidden, the one whose true identity had political or financial value. The real Julian Vance was disposable, and they used my new identity to cover your disappearance. And Liana? Elias asked, suddenly understanding his mother's lifelong penance. Liana wasn't just trying to get her son out of Eastern Europe. She was trying to hide the Volkov asset from whoever paid Albright to steal him. Julian looked at Elias, seeing not a doppelganger, but a hunted man. This isn't about mistaken identity, Volkov. This is about abduction and leverage. The psychological toll of the past few days, the dissolution of his entire existence, suddenly morphed into a focused, burning clarity. He wasn't just reclaiming a name. He was uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of whatever power structure Liana was fleeing. We have to find Albright, Elias stated, the accountant's methodical approach merging with the son's desperate drive. He's the only one who knows who paid for the theft, and where the real Julian Vance ended up, the expendable collateral. Julian nodded grimly. Albright retired to a private estate in the Hamptons 5 years ago. I know the property. It's heavily secured. But I know how architects handle blueprints, Elias. I know the structural weaknesses. For the first time, the two men who shared a face stood united, not as rivals for an identity, but as partners in dismantling a long-running, cruel deception. Elias Volkov needed his life back, and Julian Vance needed to know why he had been used as the decoy. The raid on Marcus Albright's opulent Hamptons estate was not a confrontation between two accountants or two architects, but a calculated infiltration guided by fractured memories and shared objectives. Julian, utilizing his knowledge of building security and schematic interpretation, guided Elias through the less visible service tunnels. They found Albright in his subterranean vault, ironically surrounded by financial documents detailing the Vances and Thorne's adoption clearances. Albright, a man in his late 70s, was pale and impeccably dressed, utterly unfazed by their arrival. "I should have known Liana's ghost would eventually raise the alarm," Albright said calmly, adjusting his silk tie. "You took too long to surface, Volkov. Tell us who you were working for," Elias demanded, standing beside Julian, an intimidating unit of shared appearance. "Who paid you to replace the Volkov child with the Vance collateral?" Albright chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "It wasn't about value, boy. It was about leverage." Liana Volkov wasn't just a dissident. She was a courier carrying highly sensitive encrypted ledgers concerning deep-level corruption within a transnational infrastructure firm, the firm Julian Vance's true family controlled. Albright continued, his voice oozing condescension. "Your mother intended to expose them using the legitimate Vance adoption as cover to get you out. Albright was paid by the firm's senior partners to seize the asset, you, Volkov, and ensure the other boy, the true Julian Vance, was placed where he could never access his family's power or files, effectively crippling Liana's strategy. So, the real Julian Vance, the expendable collateral, was placed with the Thornes?" Julian asked, utterly stunned. "Exactly. The Thornes were politically naive, perfect placeholders. They were supposed to raise him as Elias Thorne, a quiet boy who would never question his past, allowing the conspirators to control the Vance assets through Albright until the statute of limitations ran out on Liana's evidence." Elias felt a profound sense of wrongness, a deep, cold horror. "And what happened to the real Julian Vance?" Albright sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "A shame, really. He was sensitive. Too much grief from the sudden change in environment. He didn't adapt well to the quiet life. The Thornes doctors diagnosed severe trauma-related depression. He never became the strong heir they needed." Julian Vance stared at Albright, his face draining of color. "Depression? Trauma?" "Yes," Albright confirmed casually. "He died 5 years ago, quietly, in a specialized care facility in upstate New York. Heart complications from stress. The Thornes mourned Elias Thorne, the quiet boy who couldn't handle life. They buried him. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the mansion's air conditioning. Julian Vance, the successful architect, the man who had built a perfect life on a stolen identity, was the collateral. He was the decoy whose manufactured life had successfully hidden the real Julian Vance's death. Elias Volkov, the accountant, was the asset. He was the one who mattered, the one whose existence Liana had fought and died to protect. Julian, the man who wasn't Julian Vance, finally cracked. He sank onto a nearby crate, burying his face in his hands. I'm not anyone. I don't have a dead mother or a stolen destiny. I'm just the replacement who lived too long." Elias felt a strange surge of empathy, not for the man who took his name, but for the ghost he had become. "No," Elias said, his voice regaining the steadiness of the man who meticulously balanced the books. "You are Julian Vance. You survived. You built a life and you are very successful. Albright tried to reduce you to collateral, but you became something new. You are the man who became Elias Thorne, and you uncovered the truth alongside me. Your past is fabricated, but your present is real." Elias stepped forward, pulling out the documents, Liana's letters and the Volkov birth certificate. "This is my history," Elias said, looking at the documents that proved his true lineage. "I am Julian Volkov. I have my mother's courage and her fight. Albright, you are coming with us. You will testify about the infrastructure firm and who ordered the theft." Albright attempted a final, desperate move for a hidden panic button, but Julian, moving with the swift, practiced grace of someone who understood hidden mechanisms, intercepted him, slamming a heavy brass paperweight onto the table beside Albright's hand. Julian looked at Elias, his eyes wet but clear. "You need to take your life back, Volkov. I think I need to figure out who Julian Vance actually is, now that Elias Thorne is dead." The police, alerted by a silent GPS tracker Julian had discreetly activated upon entering the estate, arrived within the hour. Albright was apprehended, the ledgers secured. The aftermath was a slow, emotionally draining process. Elias Volkov used the authenticated Volkov birth certificate and Liana's letters to begin the process of legal reclamation in Chicago, a quiet, painstaking bureaucratic battle, a task far better suited to an accountant than a man who had just fought for his survival. He didn't try to become a hero. He didn't seek retribution against the infrastructure firm. That was Liana's final battle, now carried forward by the surviving legal contacts she had named. Elias sought only his name. Julian Vance, the architect, made a stark announcement. He was dissolving Vance and Associates and taking a sabbatical. He quietly ensured the care facility where the real Julian Vance had died was honored, perhaps finding a small sense of closure by acknowledging the fragility of the life that was stolen from him. 1 year later, Elias Volkov stood on the shores of Lake Michigan. He was dressed simply, no longer striving for the bland anonymity of the accountant, nor attempting the bold facade of the architect. He had embraced the quiet strength he found in his mother's letters. He received one last communication, a letter from Julian Vance. "Volkov, I finally understand the terror of being someone else. I am selling the brownstone. I've bought a small practice renovating historic libraries in the South. I find I prefer the smell of old paper to steel and glass. I am signing my new work simply as J. Vance. The theft was brutal, but perhaps the exchange was a strange form of liberation for us both. You have your name. I have my own ending. Be well, Julian Volkov. We shared a face, but we finally found our own souls. J. Vance." Elias smiled, a genuine, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes that were now definitively his own. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the forgotten accountant, nor was he a phantom. He was Julian Volkov, a man forged by displacement, standing on solid ground, the echoes of the two lives he had inhabited slowly receding into the vast, impersonal space of the American past. The haunting silence was replaced by the sound of his own breath, finally, unequivocally, his own.